All right, if you have a Bible, open up to the book of Acts. We are in the home stretch of this book. Now, if you're cheering, I don't know if that's good or that makes me really sad. Yeah, as Andy would say, hey, back off. We are entering into the final section now of the book of Acts. And it will feel different. If you know the book of Acts, I think Greg, you mentioned this to me just a couple weeks ago too. There's a different feel in this last section of 21 to 28. It doesn't have the kind of, sweeping geographical, cultural spread that we've been so accustomed to, where Paul is just on the move and, hitting town after town after town and these crazy places. You'll notice the change even because the videos of me teaching in these sites have stopped. Because all of a sudden, the mood changes. The pace changes. It reminds me a lot of life. I was talking to my daughter about this just last weekend. We were at the dinner in Santa Cruz again with her boyfriend. Linda was talking to John, and I was talking to Kelly, and she was telling me about her summer, and she's going to graduate in the spring, and what's she going to do? And it's funny, I was trying to tell her that partly what happens, particularly if you're a Christian and you're in high school and then very much in college, you're kind of like, you go to class, but then I want to pack my summer with something, right? I want to go on some mission trip, or I want to get this great job or internship. And so they're looking, and it's appropriate for the time. And if you know this about being around this age group, or if you remember being that age, for some of you, there are these like peaks. They're looking for these peaks. And what I was trying to tell her was, she was saying, I want to do something huge. And I said, well, you're toying with going to like, I don't know what it was, Thailand for like 2.5 months on a mission trip, and then working at an elephant farm for a month. Don't even ask me about this one. I don't know if she's going to do any of this now. And she wanted something big next year, and I was looking at her like, you're kidding, right? I mean, there's nobody in our whole church that can say, I'm going to go to Thailand for 2.5 months. I mean, there's this idea where it trains our mind to live for these peaks, right? And if you think about your life, the deep lows, and they can be very low, and these high peaks, they're measured in days, right? Most of life, do you ever catch yourself doing this? This is way off my notes, I'm sorry, Mark. Do you ever catch yourself like in the morning, like you're in your routine and you're brushing your teeth and you're going, holy cow, how many times have I done this? Do you know what I mean? Where it's just the monotony of life all of a sudden kind of weighs in. But this is where life is really made. I mean, to be sure, the lows and the highs are things we remember when we're 80. We should mark those times because they're worth marking. But most of life is not that. Most of life is slowed down and maybe feel a bit monotonous. And it's here, back to Rhonda's word, passion, it's here where we find life, I think. Most of our life is made up of that. And I don't even know why I said all that, quite frankly. Maybe partly because Luke slows the whole story down and is very true to form and very much like my life. Everything starts to just grind to a halt. And it's not boring by any stretch, because then you won't come for the next 2 months. It's not at any stretch, but it's an hourglass kind of feel to it, if you will. And this journey now that Paul is undertaking to go back to Jerusalem will now kind of reach its apex in the next several weeks, and including this morning. You'll recall he's on the end of his third missionary journey. And I would like to say he goes back to Jerusalem to slingshot his way to Rome, but since he gets stuck for over 2 years, imprisoned essentially in Israel, slingshot, it's a really, really bad slingshot. So I don't know, it's more like a marshmallow, if I could say it that way. So turn with me to Acts chapter 21. We will start in verse 1, and if you don't have a Bible, there's some Bibles in the chairs. The book of Acts is about 3/4 of the way to the right, if you're not familiar with the Bible. Verse 1 says this: when we, that means Luke is writing this, that means he is probably in this group, so and you're going to hear this word a lot. When we had departed from them and had set sail, we ran a straight course to Cos, and the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. having found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. And when we came in sight of Cyprus, leaving it on the left, we kept sailing to Syria and landed at Tyre. For there the ship was to unload its cargo. There's a map to remind us, this is the third missionary journey of Paul's. He started up on your right side at the second main hub church. The main hub church is down in Jerusalem, down at the very bottom, if you can see that. Syriac Antioch was the second main hub church, which was made up of Jews and Gentiles. He does this loop again, going back to all these churches that he'd established, to pastor them, to teach them, to grow them, to mentor them, to do exactly what Rhonda talked about this morning. And then he is now scooting back down. He goes through these places that we're not familiar with, called Cause of Roads. He stops at Patara, the text says. Patara is on the mainland. Typically, and we know this from archaeological evidence, this is a very typical pattern. They would hug the coastline in these smaller boats, which is what you can see them doing, kind of popping between Troas and Assos and Mytilene and Smyrna, and, over to Miletus. And these little things, because the wind would die down, they couldn't navigate at night. And then when they were ready to make this massive push down towards Tyre in Syria, they would stop at Patara, they would actually change ships. They would get off the small boats, they would wait for a cargo ship, they would jump on that, and that's exactly what Paul is doing at this. It says, the text says they passed by that big island of Cyprus. You'll recall Paul and Barnabas actually went through it. Barnabas is actually from that place. They had the really neat story there that you'll have to go back and listen to the sermon if you want to hear. And they land on the mainland just north of Palestine, or what we would know of as Israel, in a place called Tyre, which is an ancient trade center just to the north of Israel. Verse 4. After looking up the disciples there, we stayed, there's your we again, Luke is with him. Excuse me. We stayed there 7 days. They kept telling Paul through the Spirit, there's a weird comment, through the Spirit, not to set foot in Jerusalem. When our days there were ended, we left and started on our journey, while they all, with wives and children, escorted us until we were out of the city. After kneeling down on the beach and praying, we said farewell to one another. Then we went on board the ship, and they returned home again. So Paul, we remember this. Jesus has actually shown up in a vision with Paul in the middle of the night, and we find out from that text. Bless you, thank you so much. The perpetual cough. Thank you so much. Jesus shows up in this vision when he's at Corinth, and he tells Paul several things. First of all, don't be afraid anymore. So we know Paul's afraid. He's got so much opposition, it's just beating him down. So we know Paul's human. That's a good deal. And then he tells him a couple things. First of all, don't close your mouth. Keep talking. Just keep speaking my name and keep teaching. Keep at it. And oh, by the way, go to Jerusalem, and I promise you won't die there. That's a nice promise. And then you'll get to Rome. So he knows this already. And Paul is in a hurry to get to Jerusalem. We talked about this last week for two reasons. One reason is he's got a wad of cash with him that the Jewish and Gentile churches outside of Israel have given him to take to the Jewish church inside Jerusalem because they're impoverished. They're impoverished because of their faith now for following Jesus. They're impoverished because there's been a huge famine there. So we know partly he's in a hurry because he wants to bring this money to them. The bigger reason Paul's in a hurry, we learned last week, is he wants to get there for one of the great Jewish festivals called Shavuot. It's one of the three great grain festivals, the harvest festivals. It's the grain festivals that last 50 days of just thanking God for his kindness. And so he's in a huge hurry. He wants to get there for this festival of Shavuot. And he obviously had good winds when they were sailing, because this guy who's in a huge hurry gets to Tyre and he goes, let's wait for a week. So he's made great time on this sailing ship. And so now it's all of a sudden, hurry, hurry, hurry. Oh, I got a little extra time. It's kind of like what we do when we go on a trip, right? And he finds himself, he's got extra time. So he takes a breath, he takes a rest, he does what he always does. He just loves on these people in this church in Tyre, and he teaches them and mentors them, encourages them. And there's this weird statement in this text. We'll wrestle with this all morning. And it says, through the Spirit, they were trying to encourage him not to go to Jerusalem. It doesn't say they were encouraging him just not to go to Jerusalem. It says, through the Spirit, Luke writes. through the Spirit they were encouraging him not to go to Jerusalem. Which is a fascinating comment. Because we already know God wants Paul to go to Jerusalem, right? Jesus showed up, for heaven's sake, in a vision and told him, go to Jerusalem. And yet here, we see almost the exact opposite. In fact, I would say the exact opposite. There's a group of believers in this church that are saying, no, don't go there. And they're saying it because the Spirit has told them something. We have to break this down, because this frustrates a Bible teacher like me. I don't like inconsistencies. So on one aspect, we know what Paul heard, because we read it. Luke told us. And Luke is in this group, by the way, writing this. So we know Paul knows he's supposed to go there. And we also know, number two, God's not fuzzy. That's a word from my dad. My dad told me that all the time. God's not fuzzy. He's not alter ego. He's not split in his thoughts. So God isn't flipping all over the place on this. So we know that it's not God. So something must be amiss or unclear with these Christians in Tyre, who somehow have a sense from God that something's going to happen, but then are maybe not so right on that he shouldn't go. And I think what it is they have learned to listen to the Spirit. The Spirit has given them a sense that it will not go well for him when he gets there. And then what they do, stop me if you've heard this before, in your own noodle, is they extrapolate from that he shouldn't go. This is a really dangerous thing to do as a believer. And many of us have been faced with this. We have either done this, or, in my case, I've had this happen to me many times, with super well-meaning, committed believers, right, who have a sense from God about something, and then maybe take it an extra step and give us direction in our lives, as if God is actually telling them to tell us exactly what we're supposed to do. Anybody have this experience at all? What they do with the message is a mixture then of what comes from God, in my opinion, and what they want. And this isn't the only time. Luke is going to give us 3 stories in succession, because he knows we're not very quick, to make sure we see the danger in actually speaking for God when God may not be speaking at all. 3 times. And every time, none of them is God saying, actually, not to go. And in each case, which is good for us to see as well, Paul's resolve strengthens. Even though he's being discouraged to go, it strengthens his resolve all the more to go there. Let's follow the story then. Verse 7. When we had finished the voyage from Tyre, we arrived at Ptolemais. And after greeting the brethren, we stayed with them for a day. On the next day we left and came to Caesarea. And entering the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, we stayed with him. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who were prophetesses. Quickly on the map again to remind us where we are. So now they've left Tyre. He's now marching towards Jerusalem. He goes to Ptolemais, meets some believers. He goes to Caesarea and meets some believers there. Ptolemais, you might know it as the ancient name of Acco. And it's this really important trade center about 30 miles south. So maybe 2 days walk from Tyre, and they arrive in Caesarea, which would be technically what we would know of as within the borders of Israel. And Caesarea is really important. Jerusalem is the hub city of Israel, but now Rome runs it, and so the seat of government is in Caesarea, not in Jerusalem. This is why, like in the story of Jesus, right, with Pontius Pilate, his seat of government is in Caesarea, and he comes over to Jerusalem to handle the things during the holy days, and then he goes right back. So think of it as the Sacramento, if you will. It's the capital city now. So Caesarea is the seat of the Roman Empire for running Judah. It's a very, very important place. And we're reminded again of this guy named Philip. He should be extremely familiar to us, and if not, again, the sermons are online. You can go through them all over again. He is one of the guys, for example, when the church had a problem. Remember, there were different groups of people, and these widows over here weren't being taken care of. And the church said, if we have the teachers do it, if we have the teachers fix the problem with the widows, then they're going to stop teaching and studying. We can't have that because the word is so important in our lives. So let's protect the teachers and the elders, and let's appoint some leaders. They appointed these 7 deacons. Do you remember this? Philip is one of them. He's the guy that God called to go up to Samaria, if you can remember, to reincorporate the Samaritans, who were seen as kind of half-Jews, back into the reconstitution of Israel underneath the Messiah, Jesus. He's also the one, if you remember, that left south, and he kind of finds this Ethiopian eunuch who's reading the book of Isaiah, the scroll of Isaiah, and he doesn't understand it. One more little note here, and this literally didn't hit me till this morning. There's this weird comment, like, we need to know this. Why would Luke tell us he's got 4 virgin daughters who are prophetesses? The reason I think this is here, in the midst of these 3 successive stories where people have a sense from God of what's going to happen to Paul, and then they give him bad advice, is these are 4 gals that God has specifically given this gifting and calling of actually telling prophecies into people's lives, and not one of them speaks to Paul about not going to Jerusalem. To me, that's deafening in its silence. Verse 10. As we were staying there for some days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Now this is a weird comment again, but you should know this from our discussions. Even though they went north from Jerusalem, you always go down from the capital city and the holy city of Jerusalem. So it's not a geographic comment really, it's a statement about where the temple is. This Agabus, this prophet, comes down from Jerusalem and Judea, and coming to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own feet and hands and said, "This is what the Holy Spirit says. In this way, the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt," as if that's not obvious, "and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." When we heard this, there's Luke as well, by the way, telling on himself, as well as the local residents began begging Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. This prophet comes and he takes Paul's belt off. It was more than likely a long stretch of cloth, and they used it to carry money and things. And he unties it, and he begins to rather than tell Paul what God told him to tell him, he's acting it out. Now, if you know the Old Testament story, this should be very, very obvious. A guy like Jerry, who taught Ezekiel upstairs, this happens all over, doesn't it? I'll put you on the spot. Ezekiel does this all the time, right? Throw me a couple of it, because I know you're going off the top of your head. Bricks. He builds bricks. There's another one where there's a wall, and he's told, build a little wall and then dig your way underneath it. It's a prophetic thing he's telling you, but he wants you to do it through action. Lay on your side for how many days? Like 20, 30 days? Then flip over and lay on the other side? Not just because that side's sore. Crazy stuff, right? Jeremiah does this. He acts out prophecies. Brian's kind of my resident Jeremiah expert. Isaiah does this. God has the prophets do this when the words are super, super serious. So this isn't just a word. This is, I want you to act it out so that the punch comes even stronger. And so anybody sitting there, any Jewish person in particular, would know that this is a very strong word that this guy is given. And so it's a very strong prophecy. And again, isn't it fascinating what the response is from Paul's friends? When I read this, I personally think this is completely understandable. He's acting out how bad this is going to go to him. And if he's one of my closest friends, I would say to Paul, please don't go. This is so understandable to me. And it's normal, and it's expected, and yet there is absolutely zero indication that God is behind any of this. Which is weird. Now listen to this. It's relationally driven. This is nothing short of an outpouring of love. We know from the New Testament, right, in the Scriptures, anything done not in love is useless. Amen? If you do something and there's no love behind it, it's just as if you didn't do it at all. So we know the relational aspect. We're an outpouring of the Trinity, how significant this is. And yet, what Luke has been mentoring us through in this book of Acts is that that's not always enough. Now, that may be a strange comment, but love is not always enough. If the Spirit of God is not in it, then we have no involvement in it. That's what Luke has been trying to tell us. If God is not there, then don't be there, is the message that Luke has been telling us. And here we have Luke himself, which, by the way, Brian has always taught me this. This is what's unique about the Bible. When people wrote in antiquity stories about themselves and other people, they never made themselves look bad on purpose. Ever, right? Ever. And here Luke is saying, I was one of the main people trying to get him not to go. Isn't that cool? That to me is a testimony to the truth of the Scriptures. We have Luke himself doing this. Sometimes the Spirit gives us just enough information to know that something is going to happen or that we're supposed to go do something, and then leaves the rest up to complete clouds on what's going to actually take place. And I hear these stories all the time now. I mean, this has been the goal. If I have one goal going through this book of Acts, this is it. That we sense the Spirit all day, tapping us, pushing us. Mark Seymour, who was up above doing the technical stuff. We got in the back room. The worship team sang a little bit late. And so I said, we didn't have much time, but went through the flow and said, Mark, would you just pray for our morning? Mark, pray for our morning. And, you know, that English accent is. Just keep praying, right? He gets done, we're all leaving, and he stops, he has to come back to me. And I said, what? And he said, I had a dream before I came here that God wanted me to pray. He said, isn't that crazy? I said, yeah, but I'm not surprised. 2 weeks ago, Doug Abbott was laying in bed. He said, I could tell God just kept saying, I want you to get up and go to church. I want you to get up and go to church. He was like, yeah, I'm going to skip church today. I just kind of want to sleep in. No, I want you to go to church. So I said, okay. I mean, it was really strong on him. And so he got up, he got ready, and he's got kids, and things just got just completely discombobulated. And he's like, okay, if I go right now, I mean, there's 10 minutes left in journey by the time I get there. And he said he felt this push inside of him, go to church right now. He goes, okay. Didn't know why, just did it. He went to church, he got here, he thought, all right, I'm not going to go in there and teach Revelation. So now what do? I'm at church, like, really early for this church. These people, are you kidding me? He shows up, he goes, well, I guess what I'll do is I'll go in and get my seat. So he came in, get his seat. Can you imagine at 10 to 10 in this church, getting your seat? Cordelia and Beverly, you know how silly this is. The only two people that get here like a half an hour early just to pray and read the Word, right? And next thing you know, somebody sits next to him, and he could just feel heat coming off this person between him and them. He said it was the weirdest, most mystical thing he's ever had. And church ends, and he ends up talking to this person, closed the churches, probably. There wasn't a single person left. They talked for an hour after the service. Josh Smith, and I won't tell the details of it, he was sitting in church a month or two ago, right? And he could feel the whole time, which, you know, he had to explain to me, he wasn't being rude to me. God was telling him, I want you to leave the service. I want you to leave the service. Why? Doesn't matter why. Just go leave the service. Okay, and he went out and walked by the classrooms and prayed. He's like, okay, God, that seems a little silly. And the next thing you know, God had him at an encounter. There was a reason for it. Didn't need to know why. What might make sense on what God tells us that we add to it may not be the right thing. What might seem best or easiest or safest might not be from God. The strongest case I've ever seen from this was Nate Milheim and Andrew. So many of you know that Nate was a youth pastor here, I don't know, 10 years ago. My math was bad. He felt called to inner city stuff, so he joined an inner city ministry in the Mission District in San Francisco. He did that for 2 or 3 years with a guy named Mark Scandrett. That was cool, but it was like, okay, God, you're just training me. This isn't the place. And finally, he felt called to inner city Oakland. And when I mean inner city Oakland, Rhonda, do I mean inner city Oakland? I mean inner city Oakland. And by the way, he didn't feel called to just minister there. God called him to live there. Live there. With his 3 little kids. And I can't tell you how many times Nate has told me people have tried to convince him to leave him. His family, his closest friends, that don't do this, this is bad, you're putting your kids in danger. All things, by the way, that are correct, make sense, are obvious, and things that any one of us would have said to them, except for one small problem. God called him. So for Nate, all of that other stuff was chatter to derail him from the very thing that God was asking him to do. And listen to what Paul does with this. Verse 13. Then Paul answered, "What are you doing? Weeping and breaking my heart. I am ready not only to be bound, but even to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." And since he would not be persuaded, which means they still tried, I love this, these are good friends. We fell silent, remarking, "The will of the Lord be done." This is right out of the passage with Jesus. Do you remember when Jesus predicted his own death? And Peter tries to tell him, "Don't go to Jerusalem then because we love you, don't go." You recall at all what Jesus said to Peter? "Get behind me, Peter. Get behind me, Satan," he said to him. Paul's friend's reaction and the dissuading of Paul is to actually get him to not be in step with God. And again, what's amazing about this is that it's beautifully motivated. This is what's so hard for me to read. It's so beautifully motivated. They're looking out for Paul. And they know from God directly he's going to get extremely hurt. And yet they're completely off in what they say to him. In this term, breaking my heart, it's a rare verb in Greek. It means to crush to dust. You are not just breaking my heart, you are powdering me. I mean, you are breaking me down to a point where I'm not going to be able to get up and do this. We need so much. If we're committed to learning this lesson in Acts that Luke is teaching us, that we need to be in step with the Spirit. We need to lay in bed like Doug did and go, "Wow, I just feel this strong urge from God to do this." Or like Josh, I feel the remark, I got to pray this morning. We need to be in step with that. But if we're going to be committed to that, we need to recognize when opinion is forming in our mouth. Amen? As if it is somehow then what we say from God. Paul is telling them, I am ready to walk to my death on behalf of Jesus if that's what he asked me to do. Please, and by the way, that's going to be really hard. Please don't make this harder in my life. And remember, for Paul, ultimately, this isn't about Paul. This is about being where Jesus is for Paul. And watching Jesus make life right, no matter how hard it is on Paul. And fortunately, these people are so committed to walking with God, even after doing this wrong multiple times, they say, even I can recognize this. And you're right, we're wrong. And you need to go there. God is telling you this. It's a cool thing. Verse 15. And after these days, there's Luke still with him, got ready. Isn't this neat? Now Luke is going with him. This is a humble guy. This is a guy that's learning. We got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. And some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us, taking with us Manasseh of Cyprus, a disciple of long standing with whom we were to lodge. So this is roughly a journey of about 60 miles, about 3 days' walk to get to Jerusalem. Between this section and chapter 24, verse 13, Luke is going to narrate 12 days. He's going to spend 3 whole chapters on 12 days. And then the legal proceedings for multiple chapters after that take up 2 years before the governor Festus, before the governor Felix, locked in jail before King Agrippa II. it just slows to a halt between Shavuot 57 AD and AD 59. Just a side note, because this will come up in a second. You remember that the Jerusalem church was having a problem. They were having an issue, these followers of Jesus, and it was about the Gentiles and Paul. And their feeling was that Paul was letting Gentiles become followers of God and followers of Messiah Jesus, but they were not becoming Jewish. And so there were some people in the Jewish Jesus following faith that felt like Gentiles needed to actually become Jewish to be saved. And that got corrected. We remember that issue has been resolved. The problem is now there's another issue that has come up about Paul, and this one is about, and it's false, but there's a whole group of people now saying that Paul is actually trying to get Jewish followers of Jesus to stop being Jewish. That he's trying to tell these Jews that recognize Jesus as Messiah to give up their Jewish way of life. And as a side note to all this, we have to remember always, historically, when this is. This is around AD 57. In less than 10 years, Rome will burn Jerusalem and the temple to the absolute ground, the temple never to be rebuilt again. So the political and religious volatility in the city is at its absolute height. So a group of Jews, Paul, Luke, and these people, with Gentiles with them, marching into Jerusalem, right, under the rule of the Roman Empire, would hardly have been welcomed in a grand way. And so we have to keep that in the back of our mind always. Verse 17. After we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren, these are the Jewish Jesus followers, received us gladly. And the following day, Paul went in with us to James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the Jerusalem church. And all the elders were present. And after he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed in Jesus. And they are all zealous for the Torah. And they have been told about you that you are teaching the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses' words, telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to their customs." So James is telling Paul, we're so excited about you, but there's a problem. And this issue is coming up that you're skirting people from once they follow Jesus to give up their Judaism. This church knows that Paul is sincere and has been following God. And they know that this religious pressure is not accurate in any way. That's why he phrases it, there's things that are being told about you. In the Greek, this means it's false instruction. Nowhere, by the way, in the book of Acts does it ever say that Paul tried to get a Jewish person to not act Jewish. I mean, all you have to do is remember one story. The guy Timothy a few weeks ago. Remember this? Timothy has a Jewish mom and a Gentile dad. So the Gentile dad puts his foot down and says, no son of mine is going to be circumcised, so he's never circumcised. Timothy meets Paul. He's got a Jewish mother. He meets Paul. Paul leads him to Jesus. He gives his life to Jesus. And Timothy says, man, I want to go minister with you, brother. I want to travel everywhere. And Paul says, I'm totally in, but you're going to get circumcised. You're not coming with me looking like that. If you ever wonder if Paul is committed to following the proper things of Torah while he followed Jesus, you just have to know that one. And it wasn't because he thought Timothy needed to do this to gain salvation. It wasn't because he thought God would like him more. It was none of that. It was because if he didn't follow the ways of Torah, because he was never released from those things, then the other Jews would never listen to him. And so for Paul, easy for Paul to say, this was totally worth Timothy going through this for the gospel to advance. So of course Paul doesn't think this. Of course he's not teaching these things. So we know it's completely distorted. But they also know these accusers are really, really, really problematic. And they're going to make things very difficult for Paul. Verse 22. What then is to be done, James says? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore, do this that we tell you. We came up with an idea, he says. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you. and that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. We've heard about this Nazarite kind of deal. You know, it's a time you're either deeply in prayer for something in the future or thanking something for God in the past. It comes out of the book of Numbers, chapter 6. And they would shave their heads, make this vow for a period of time, no alcohol, don't touch graves, no dead bodies, no memorial services. These really, really, really dedicated times. Paul, we saw, do this in chapter 18. So there's these 4 men. They clearly don't have the money to do this, so they're going through this Nazarite purification process, but they don't have money to buy sacrificial animals at the temple in order to make an offering to God. So James says, I got a great idea. We can kill 3 birds with 1 stone. First of all, pay for their animals to be killed, so that people see, these accusers see how committed you are to the Torah. Number 2, you've been hanging out with Gentiles, so you're impure, and you can't go to the temple unless you've been purified for 7 days. So you go through it with them, and then they'll doubly see how committed you are to this whole process. And we'll do this in front of everybody, and number 3, it'll convince everybody watching that you still love the Torah. Verse 25, but concerning the Gentiles who have believed, he's going to restate this earlier issue. He wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and being strangled, and from fornication. Those are the 4 things that they decided in this earlier section in Acts that I don't want to belabor again. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, he went into the temple now, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each of them. So Paul undergoes this week-long purification. He pays for these 4 guys. His week coincides with their week. It all works great. He does this great display, and it looks like, wow, the plan of James, this should really work. It doesn't work at all, by the way. And over the next several weeks, we'll see there is no effort that's going to work to keep Paul out of trouble with his accusers. Let's stop here then, and I want to close with a couple thoughts that we've been hammering now for the last 30 minutes. And they, like usual, these 2 thoughts, they go together, but they're really important, I think, we remember. First of all is this statement. If it's hard, it doesn't mean it's bad. Our culture has really screwed this up, by the way. And we don't get to blame other generations. We're all part of this. Brian is a prophet in his own right and a teacher. And Brian has this way, I love talking to him about stuff like this, because Brian has this way of, it's like this prophetic thinking. He has a way of summing up like epochs or times or in history and giving you, I mean, he can take an entire segment of history and then describe it in a line. It's really, really helpful and cool to listen to. And for me, it's like, wow, I would have never thought that way or seen that. So we were talking about this very thing, and he made this comment to me. He said, in the Middle Ages, during the Middle Ages, so I know, Doug, get your pen and paper out. He's going to give you one of these lines. He said, in the Middle Ages, they had this way of thinking. And their way of thinking was that there was great honor in suffering for something good. And he said, part of the problem with the history is, they decided to do something, and then they ended up going to Israel and killing all the Jews, which was a terrible deal. So he said he'd love to try to study this more because he'd love to find what they did that was honorable through that. But they knew something about life. They knew that suffering wasn't all bad if it was done for the right reason. Right? Does that make sense? And then Brian flipped it over and he said, this is not our culture. I said, well, Brian, what is our culture? And he said, our culture is comfort. Isn't that true? Our culture's number one goal is to be comfortable. We had a bunch of hotel points. My wife and I just went to Utah skiing. We stayed at the St. Regis in Deer Valley. I thought I knew what comfort was. We had a butler. We checked in, and the gal behind the desk said, Mr. McBride, Mrs. McBride, let me introduce you to Albert, your butler. And by the way, I could get used to this real quick. We had a doorbell in our hotel room, people. You had a button, there was a TV behind the bathroom mirror because nobody can shave without the Today Show on. There was a cocoa bar at 3 o'clock. Not just any old cocoa bar. I I mean a cocoa bar with bowls of fatty goodness to just dump into it so that you had to drink your cocoa with a fork and a knife. There were Fifi dogs coming out of the elevator. It was bizarre and really kind of fun. But all week long, I was just inundated with just comfort. This is what life is about. Walking alongside Jesus does not work like this, in case you hadn't figured this out. Jesus pours himself into his disciples, and he hears them in the background arguing about who will sit next to him at his throne. Jesus loves on some Gentiles, which the Jewish people were supposed to do from the beginning. They were the light of the world and didn't want to do it. And he's marked as a traitor. Jesus speaks to the Jewish leadership about how unloving they are as leaders, and they string him up for it. You know, we've spent the last 3.5 years kind of on this plan God laid out for me. We spent 9 months looking at the Old Testament with really one goal 3 years ago, and that was, what is the story that we are a part of, this Old Testament story? And then we took a little break, and then we spent 1 year and 4 months, and we looked at the Gospel of Luke for 1 year and 4 months on how Jesus doesn't step out of the mist. He is the fulfillment of everything God had predicted in the Old Testament. He is what is turning the chair back upright, if you will. We took another little break, and now we have been looking at the book of Acts, and it will be a 10-month journey by the time we finish on Easter, with really one goal in mind, that we stay sensitive, that we learn what it means when God's kind of like, doing this, just nudging, tapping, pulling, and that we don't fight that. We just go, God, wherever you're pulling, I don't care where it is as long as you're there. It's the Moses mentality. God, if you move, I'll move. If you stop, I'll stop. But no way we're going to do something separate from that. Right? That's what we're trying to learn from Luke mentoring us in this book. But part of what we need to learn is that if it's hard, it may be right. So don't think for a minute that when God taps you that it's like, well, if God is in this, then clearly this should be super simple. Easy, not tiring. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. We're walking out the suffering of Christ on behalf of humanity. It will be painful, people. And the other piece that goes to me with this is what we've already talked about. And then, when the Spirit taps us, we need to be very, very, very cautious how we direct others with us. What God may give us is just a piece. Don't extrapolate beyond that. And if you do, realize it's just a pin and speak it as such. Right? Because what I'm seeing in this church is more and more, and I think it's going to get really stronger, is a church of individuals, a church that really understands how much God cares for them. The lengths that Jesus has gone through to die for us. And how actively involved Jesus is if we've given our life to follow him. That he's actively, every day, continuing to do and teach through us. Which means every day he's prodding and pulling and interjecting himself into our life. He can do it on his own, by the way. Right? It's Jesus going into Jerusalem. If they don't do this, the stones will cry out. But he doesn't want to do it on his own because it's so exciting to watch darkness turn into light, to watch pain turn into healing, that he wants us to experience it with him. So he's inviting us into that, not just to make our life a living hell, but to actually allow us to take the living hell out of other people's lives and be excited when we see it. Amen? So sense the privilege in that and know that when it's tiring, when it's hard, that as long as God's behind it, it doesn't matter. And if somebody counters you with something other than a direct thing from Scripture, then we need to realize that may just be chatter. And maybe friends coming alongside us, but let's be very careful because you will see people do wacky stuff. You will see a guy get out of the church service because God said leave the church service. It won't make any sense to anybody else, including the guy that left. But he will tap you. Let's pray. Jesus, we only have this privilege because We have invited you into our lives. Invited you. What a silly statement. We have stopped pushing you out of our lives, is maybe a better way to say it. There may be people here this morning, Father, that get up every day and just try to wing their life without you. And Father, for these people, I would ask that you would clarify yourself to them. You would meet them in a unique way. That they would realize that the only thing standing between them and life with you is a simple acknowledgement that they've lived that life without you. So Father, in this moment of quietness, for those of us that have invited you, Jesus, into our soul, we thank you that you continue to teach and do through us. May we have eyes to see and ears to hear. And for those, Father, who have not bowed their knee to Jesus, would you make yourself more known to them this morning? In Jesus' name we pray.